From 1988 to 2000, the NBA played its toughest brand of basketball. Team defense was physical and even suffocating for elite scorers. A single three-pointer could carry a team for half a quarter, as long as they boxed out at the other end. And trash talk was much more than just a series of passive-aggressive Twitter exchanges. During this era, a series of 4 rivalries delivered some of the most intense, raw, and even violent basketball you'll ever see. The catalyst to this was the bad boy Detroit Pistons and Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. The Pistons gave way to the next Windy City nemesis, the New York Knicks. The Knicks battled on a separate front 6 times from '93 to 2000 against the Indiana Pacers. But it was that final rivalry at the end of the century that gave fans absolutely everything in spades: the New York Knicks versus the Miami Heat. Fans back then were treated to a fierce animosity accentuated by a divisive figurehead. Hall of Fame talents battling bruising defenders, buzzer beaters, controversies, violence, and something that will never happen again: 4 consecutive playoff series that were each decided in the final game. Pretty nuts, huh? Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what was the craziest rivalry in NBA history. Our story begins with a keystone bridging both franchises, Pat Riley. He's as integral to this rivalry as the players on the court, and in particular, Knicks fans won't let you forget it. One of the most accomplished coaches of all time, Riley won 4 championships in the 80s with the Showtime Lakers. Over the course of 4 seasons in New York, he helped turn the Knicks into an Eastern Conference powerhouse. Their best season came in '94, when they advanced to the finals for the first time in 21 years. But in this new era of basketball with physical, wily defenders like Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, and Hakeem Olajuwon, Riley had to strategize and implement differently than he did in LA. Anchored by future Hall of Famer Patrick Ewing, the intimidating Charles Oakley, and the chippy John Starks, the Knicks surrendered the fewest points per game during Riley's tenure. Put simply, Riley's Knicks had been this brooding bunch of hooligans that beat the shit out of you, said former Knicks beat reporter Mike Wise. But even though Riley made the most of his roster, he didn't have everything he needed to bring a championship to the Big Apple. While negotiating his contract extension, he voiced his need to make player personnel decisions. But amid a change in ownership and 2 years of failed negotiations, Riley's relationship with the Knicks organization soured.
I just don't want to get into that conversation. I will sit down with Dave and we'll talk. I haven't talked about contract for a month or 2.
The media began to receive leaks about his contract, and team president Dave Checketts even said, and I'm paraphrasing, it was time for Riley to sign or else. I was expecting a good faith proposal from this guy, and I got a f***ing threat, Riley said months later. That same night, Riley's attorney delivered his client's verbal resignation. Simultaneously, Riley began negotiating with the Miami Heat, not just for another head coaching role, but the decision-making power that could come as team president. Now that doesn't seem problematic, but Riley hadn't actually filed his formal resignation until 2 weeks later. In fact, he actually faxed it to the Knicks and peaced out to Greece for a bit. And since he had signed his new role with the Heat while under contract for 1 more year, the Knicks wouldn't let him go quietly. They filed a grievance against the Heat for tampering, and consequently, Miami forfeited $1 million and what became the 19th overall pick in '96. Many of Riley's players were understanding, having seen the writing on the wall, but others still felt let down.
To get a deal as good as he got, I mean, you would do the same thing, and I know I would.
At the last meeting of the season, we had a big meeting, and we was in there talking about how he was preparing for the next year. Next thing you know, 2 days later, your heart just don't change to Miami Heat. He came and just told us the story the next day, a couple of days, and just packed his bags up and left.
In Miami, Pat Riley and assistant coach Stan Van Gundy got to work on building a championship-caliber team using the Knicks blueprint. First, Riley needed his Patrick Ewing, an offensive force who could hold his own defensively. So from Charlotte, he traded for rising superstar Alonzo Mourning. Next, he needed someone who could not only score, but also get in your head like John Starks. In the middle of his first season, he traded for Tim Hardaway from the Run TMC Warriors. Miami improved by 10 wins, but in the playoffs were defeated by Riley's on-court nemesis, Michael Jordan, and the record-setting 72-win Bulls. Riley was just getting started though. In the offseason, he pursued his Charles Oakley equivalent, signing the 6'11" P.J. Brown. He also inked 3-time All-Star Thunder Dan Marley, who in '93 helped the Phoenix Suns get to the finals. The makeup of Riley's squads, first in New York and then in Miami, was what WFAN radio host Mike Francesa described as a lunch pail mentality. No rebounds, no rings. No blood, no foul. Nobody comes down our lane. With a remodeled roster and a proven coach, the Heat were taking off as an Eastern Conference contender. But despite losing their coach to Miami, the Knicks refused to fade from contention. New York, 1996. The Knicks thought they made the right replacement hire in Don Nelson, who previously manned the bench for Hardaway's Warriors. But despite a respectable 34-25 record in his first year, Nelson wasn't cutting it. With 23 games remaining, he was shown the door. In came Riley's former New York assistant and his current assistant's brother, 34-year-old Jeff Van Gundy. He was just 27 when he joined the Knicks staff as an assistant, but from early on it was clear he intended to do everything in his power to put his team over the top. Like Miami, New York needed to reload its roster to challenge in the East. First, they traded for Larry Johnson. Playing alongside Alonzo Mourning in Charlotte, he was coming off a bounce-back season of 20 points and 8 rebounds per game. Next, they signed sharpshooter Allen Houston, who the previous 2 years with the Pistons hit a Reggie Miller-esque 42% from three-point land. Lastly, they replaced aging veteran point guard Derek Harper with Chris Childs, who came off a breakout year of nearly 13 points and 7 assists per contest. With both New York and Miami restocked, it was only inevitable they would engage in some epic clashes in the years to come.
And tonight at Madison Square Garden, a regular season game with much larger implications as the New York Knicks, cruising along at 17-6, take on the suddenly struggling Miami Heat.
You know it's a rivalry when fans boo someone on the court that isn't the opposing team or the refs. The ex-coach's return to the basketball cathedral was front and center in New York. Local newspapers ran sensational headlines and columns like "Boo Pat the Rat" and "Give Riley his due." Fans flooded the Garden, many feeling like Riley had walked out on them. Even the very worst of them issued death threats.
I feel he's a turncoat and a traitor, and basically we don't need him because we're still doing well without him.
I know I'm going to be a little, I don't know. I'm not going to be too nice to him, that's for sure.
They're going to be kind of hard on Pat Riley. He's going to get in for a rough night.
I think he should be in jail.
Welcomed by a choir of boos, Riley blew kisses to the fans and waved his arms as if to say, "Let me have it." The Heat would win the Atlantic Division with an impressive 61-21 record, and yet they lost their final 3 games against New York. Meanwhile, the Knicks finished with 57 wins, the same total from their run to the finals 3 years prior. Moving on to the playoffs, both teams prevailed in the first round and would square off in the first of 4 straight postseason gauntlets. In Game 1, the Knicks defense held the Heat to just 37% from the field. Ewing's and one dunk on Mourning down the stretch lifted New York to an 88-79 victory. Games 2 and 3, in part, came down to a blocked shot. And in Game 4, the Knicks limited Miami to just 53 points heading into the fourth quarter, taking a commanding 3-1 series lead. Up until this point, the rivalry had been everything it would continue to be: gritty, nasty, down to the wire. But from Game 5 onward, it would morph into a feud in which the winner couldn't give two shits about who they had to play next. Both teams had a hard time taking care of the ball, but still, the Heat controlled the game by way of the glass. Miami was pulling away in the fourth quarter, extending their lead to 15. But even in the waning minutes, defeat was something that the Knicks weren't prepared to accept. Charles Oakley turned up the tension with a hard screen on Hardaway, and after nearly punching the irate Mourning, got tossed. In the words of legendary Knicks broadcaster Mike Breen, it was just like, let's get out of here and let's get away. All of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. Moments later, with Hardaway at the foul line for a separate infraction, Charlie Ward crouched down and drove P.J. Brown to the baseline, and like steel on flint, the rivalry finally ignited.
P.J. Brown throws Charlie Ward, watch out. This one's going to get really ugly. P.J. Brown picked Charlie Ward up and threw him into the photographer's row.
Who would have thought that Charlie Ward, whom his coach deemed the quietest guy, would take on a much larger Brown in a game that was already long lost?
I was boxing out like I usually do on free throws, and they saying I'm trying to take out his knees, which is not true.
And as for Brown, who won the J. Walter Kennedy Citizenship Award that year,
and I just protected myself and picked him up and got the man off my knees.
The NBA doled out several suspensions, starting with 1 game for Ward and the rest of the series for Brown. Johnson and Starks were suspended 1 game for leaving the bench. Fans threw cups and plastic bottles at Starks as he flipped off the crowd on his way to the locker room. And unfortunately, because Ewing and Houston left the bench to break up the scuffle, they too were banned for a game. So with 5 suspended players, how would the Knicks dress a full roster? Well, according to league rules, the suspensions would have to be divided across the remaining games in the series. The Players Association wasn't happy with the situation and filed an injunction lobbying to let everyone play while a judge reviewed the suspensions on a case-by-case basis. But the bans were quickly upheld. Ward, Houston, and Ewing would miss Game 6, and should the series go to a 7th game, then Starks and Johnson would be out. Even so, the Knicks looked poised to finish the series early on in Game 6. And yet, Mourning took advantage of a Ewing-less Knicks, shooting 10 of 18 from the field and totaling 28 points. The Heat won 95-90, forcing my favorite combination of 2 words, Game 7. Returning to Miami, the Heat had all the momentum on their side, and while the Knicks welcomed back Ewing and company, they'd be missing Johnson and Starks in a winner-take-all. Led by Tim Hardaway, the Heat stormed out of the gate with an 18-0 run in the first quarter. The future Hall of Fame point guard torched New York for 38 points, shooting 6 of 10 from beyond the arc and recording 5 steals. His team's 17-point halftime lead was all they needed to cruise to a series win. Ewing was equally spectacular, putting up 37 points and 17 boards, but he was anything but pleased with his numbers. On the subject of believing that his team had what it took to win a title, he replied, "I definitely thought so. I felt they robbed me. They robbed me of a great opportunity." And as for his former coach, I know this is disconcerting for the Knicks. I don't blame them. What happened turned the whole thing around and upside down. But we all know who ended up having the last laugh. 1998 marked a turning of the tide in the rivalry. The Knicks took advantage of a weak division to finish in second, albeit with 14 fewer wins than last year. Their prize was a first-round matchup with the Heat in a best-of-5. The biggest factor in their decline was the absence of Patrick Ewing, who missed most of the season with a broken wrist. He would have to sit the series out, and so the Knicks needed a lot more out of everyone. The home team Heat took advantage of the situation in Game 1, behind Hardaway's 34 points. Trailing by 10 after the first quarter, the Knicks got a much-needed lift off the bench in the form of 25 points from Starks, series tied. Like Game 1, the Heat dominated the first half of Game 3 and rode Vashawn Leonard's postseason career-high 28 points to regain the series. But now we get to the real good stuff, Game 4. The Knicks had clamped down defensively, and with 5 players in double figures, were one final possession away from forcing a Game 5. But then, the chaos of last year's brawl reared its ugly head.
They're flying at the other end. Larry Johnson is one of them. Here we go. Oakley and Mourning have at each other.
Mourning had pushed Johnson while setting a screen, and in a matter of seconds, the two were making solid contact, albeit with the air. Meanwhile, Van Gundy approached Mourning from behind to detain him, and upon getting tagged by Johnson, ended up on the ground holding onto Mourning's leg. You know, people ask me about that, and truly, and I'm not trying to be funny, but I understand why some criminals plead temporary insanity. I have no recollection. They say, "What were you thinking?" And obviously, I wasn't. I fell down Mourning's leg because he's so big and strong, but also Larry Johnson hit me with a glancing blow a little bit, so I was a little unaware. The league suspended Mourning and Johnson for Game 5, and this time, Miami would be the one paying the piper. The Knicks were absolutely surging, taking a 17-point lead into halftime. The Heat wouldn't go down without a fight though. Hardaway dropped 15 in the second half to close the deficit to just 2. But that wasn't quite enough, as Houston's 20 in the final 2 quarters fueled a 98-81 New York victory. Ewing came back for the second round against the Pacers, but just wasn't the same. The Knicks fell in 5 games. Now, the final 2 years of this rivalry didn't have that same no love lost as earlier, and yet, it produced equally amazing moments. The Knicks would first need to make key moves to compete at Miami's level. In exchange for the aging Charles Oakley, they landed a young Marcus Camby, who led the NBA in blocks the previous season. And in a package trade, Starks, Chris Mills, and Terry Cummings were sent to Golden State for 3-time All-Star Latrell Sprewell. Let's just say that 1 year after choking his coach, PJ Carlesimo, he needed a change of scenery. New York actually regressed in the lockout-shortened season, but down the stretch won 6 of 8 to secure the final playoff spot in the East. The Heat roster largely stayed the same, and with the aid of Michael Jordan's retirement, finished first in the conference. The two squared off once again in the first round. Only once in playoffs history had an 8 seed defeated a 1 seed. In 1994, it was the Denver Nuggets against the Seattle Supersonics. But like I said earlier, this rivalry had everything. We've been praising Hardaway for much of this video, but Game 1 just wasn't his night, as he shot just 4 of 19 from the field. Apart from Mourning's 27, no other Miami player eclipsed 11 points. Sprewell's 22 off the bench guided his team to a dominating road win, 95-75. The Heat defense tightened up in Game 2 en route to an 83-73 victory. The Knicks defense was equally suffocating in Game 3, led by Camby's 4 steals, a crushing 97-73 dub. The Knicks were looking strong in the first half of Game 4 as they aimed to close out the series, and yet the Heat bench carried the load down the stretch, with 16 points from Terry Porter, 14 from Clarence Weatherspoon, and 10 from Leonard. Miami outscored New York by a jaw-dropping 19 points in the fourth quarter, coming through 87-72. This set up yet another Game 5, and perhaps the best contest this rivalry gave us. Tied at 23 after 1, Heat up by 4 at the half. And by the start of the fourth quarter, that lead evaporated, 60-60. Flash forward to the final minute, Terry Porter made a pair of free throws to give the Heat a 3-point lead. 20 seconds later, Ewing drew a foul from Mourning and sank 2 of his own to cut the deficit to 1. At the other end, Sprewell stripped Hardaway, and following a timeout, the Knicks put the ball into the hands of one Allen Wade Houston.
Houston ducks under, got it! With 8 tenths left!
Porter got a good look with just under a second left, but couldn't get it to go. The 8-seed Knicks knocked off the Heat in a stunning fashion that catalyzed a Cinderella run. They swept the Hawks in the next round and avenged last year's defeat against Indiana, taking out the Pacers in 6 to advance to the finals. No other 8-seed has ever gotten that far. Unfortunately, the twin towers of David Robinson and Tim Duncan stood in the way of a title, as the Knicks were defeated by the top-seeded Spurs in 5 games. You might think the Knicks would have experienced an emotional hangover the following season, from nearly missing the playoffs, to taking down their heavily favored adversary again, to making it to the finals. Instead, New York was second in their division and swept the Raptors in the first round. Meanwhile, Miami unsurprisingly took the division again, including 3 out of 4 against the Knicks. They then rattled off 3 in a row in the first round against the Detroit Pistons, moving on to face, right, those guys. Just like Game 5 last year, the teams were tied heading into the fourth, locked up at 68. Tied at 83 in the final minute, Mourning sank the final 2 buckets, and Miami escaped, 87-83. New York tied the series with a 21-4 run in the second half, and they held the Heat to just 34% from the floor. It's crazy to think it took this long for one of these playoff meetings to go into overtime, but that's exactly what we witnessed in Game 3. Although, we wouldn't have gotten there without Ewing's 17-footer with just 2 seconds left. Ultimately, rookie Anthony Carter would answer back in front of a shocked Garden crowd.
For the lead, down it goes!
But look at this shot, it's behind the backboard, and you're not supposed to be allowed to shoot the ball behind the backboard, so the shot should have been disallowed right from the beginning.
Should the basket have counted? Upon review, the call was upheld, and Carter and the Heat escaped with a 2-1 series lead. Another unlikely hero emerged in Game 4, Charlie Ward. Remember him? He saved the best of his 72 playoff games for tonight, sinking 8 of 13 for 20 points. The rest of the New York starters eclipsed double figures, cruising to a 91-83 dub. Back at home, the Heat retook the series lead behind 21 points from Jamal Monster Mash Mashburn. The Knicks only got to the foul line 12 times and fell 87-81. Miami looked like a team of destiny for the first half of Game 6, as if 24 minutes were all that stood in the way of their franchise's first championship. 45-30 Heat. But what unfolded instead is one of the greatest comebacks of the era. He may have only shot 6 of 17, but the 37-year-old Ewing was clutch. With under 2 minutes remaining, he slammed down a dunk to cut the lead to 2. His teammates, Houston and Chris Childs, sank their last 4 free throws, 72-70 Knicks. In their final possession, the Heat went with the same hot hand that drained their previous 2 shots, the hero from Game 3, Anthony Carter. But with a chance to win the series, his 3-pointer missed the mark. 72-70 Knicks, a 15-point comeback to force Game 7. You can't script a better ending to this 4-year war. The future Hall of Famer Alonzo Mourning saved perhaps his best playoff game for this moment. 29 points, 13 boards, 5 blocks. He dropped 14 in the first quarter alone and helped Miami build up a 9-point lead. Quarter 2 was the Latrell Sprewell show, as his 13 points drove a fierce response, the Knicks leading 45-39 at the half. The two teams went blow for blow in the final 2 quarters, 65 all after 3, 79 all with under 3 minutes. With 92 seconds remaining and down a deuce, Hardaway drained a 3 to regain the lead. Mourning tried to strip Ewing and failed, giving his Georgetown predecessor an easy dunk for the lead. Miami had one final chance that would end, only fittingly, in controversy. Drawing a double team, Mourning found an open Mashburn, who passed up a possible game winner, dishing it off to Clarence Weatherspoon. In a battle for the rebound with 2.1 seconds left, the refs somehow awarded Sprewell and the Knicks a timeout. Mashburn was so heated, see what I did there, that he even chased the refs off the court. And get this, Sprewell even admitted that he never signaled for a timeout.
Ward to Childs, and that's it.
For the third straight year, the underdog Knicks knocked off Pat Riley's Miami Heat. They bowed out in 6 games to a familiar foe, the Pacers. The Knicks-Heat rivalry quickly fell apart in the 2000s. It was truly the end of an era, as the Knicks traded their aging Hall of Famer Patrick Ewing to the Sonics. And his counterpart, Alonzo Mourning, was diagnosed with a serious kidney disease and missed significant time for several consecutive seasons. Even Pat Riley had to take a break from the hardwood, delegating coaching duties to Stan Van Gundy for over 2 years. Eventually, Riley returned to the bench and achieved what he came to Miami for 11 years ago, an NBA championship with an Eastern Conference team. A star-studded cast of Dwayne Wade, Shaquille O'Neal, Antoine Walker, and my all-time favorite, Gary Payton, overcame a 2-0 series deficit against Dirk Nowitzki's Dallas Mavericks to win the 2006 finals. Meanwhile, the Knicks struggled heavily, making the playoffs just once between 2002 and 2010. They would eventually rise to some relevance with the likes of Carmelo Anthony, Amare Stoudemire, and Chauncey Billups. New York got past the first round in 2013 with this group, but as I'm producing this video, that's the franchise's only series victory since 2000. One of their more recent postseason defeats came against Carmelo's most popular peer, LeBron James, and a Miami Heat squad that won 2 of their 4 straight finals appearances. Neither franchise has won a championship since then. But if we learned anything from watching these adversaries go toe-to-toe for 4 straight playoffs, and with each battle going the distance, it's that no trophy could compare to the sheer delight of sending the other team packing. So what do you think is the best NBA rivalry of all time excluding Lakers-Celtics? Let me know down in the comments below. I found this one ranked as high as 3rd by Yahoo Sports, and personally, I would actually put it ahead of Bulls-Pistons. Celtics-Lakers, of course, is kind of untouchable, but this one for me, for that era, is number 1. These teams were built almost identically as you saw in this video, and also, they went the distance every single series. That's amazing. I personally don't see that ever happening again. And also let me know what other stories you want me to cover in future videos, whether that's basketball or otherwise. We're talking about controversies, scandals, rivalries, larger-than-life personalities, all that good stuff here on Sudden Death Sports. Monthly videos on the 1st of every month, so I'll see you back here on May 1st. In the meantime, if you haven't already, check out our video on the shocking career of Bill Romanowski of the NFL, and if you like hockey, you can see that I do. Make sure you check out my other channel, that is Twisted Wrister Hockey. I cover the NHL on a season-by-season basis, and we got the playoffs coming up, so I'll have lots of content for you around that time. Thank you so much for tuning in here. I'm Nick, and I'll see you next time on Sudden Death Sports.